So that's why I have my coat on. So, all right. So if you weren't here so Sue, you weren't, is that last week you weren't here?
Correct.
All right, so we'll get you caught up. What we were talking about was the existence, I guess we talked about that over the last several sessions. We were talking about the existence of God and how do we know that God exists? Philosophically, even scientifically, what are some evidences that God exists? And so we're going to narrow down the field of worldviews here today. We're going to say which worldviews can be true and which ones are definitely not true based on what we learned about God so far. So what we first learned about the cosmological argument. So remember, the cosmological argument was that everything with a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning, and we went through the whole argument of how do we know the universe had a beginning. And so therefore the universe had a cause, and that was the cosmological argument. And what we learned from that is that whatever caused the universe, which the only rational explanation for that would be God, that one infinite divine being, what we learn about him is that he is spaceless, so he's not made up of space, he's not made up of matter or material, so he's not made up of any aspect of this universe. He is timeless, because of the nature of him being eternal and infinite. He doesn't exist in time, he's not a part of time, he's outside of time, and he's immaterial. And so, with that being said, then the other thing is that if God is infinite, then that precludes any other infinite being. Right? So that, hopefully you can understand what I'm saying there, right? Like, if you have one infinite being, he's infinite, you can't have another infinite being because then now you have a fraction, you have a percentage, right? Like, right? You can't have two. So that's how we know there has to be one God. Now, there can't be multiple gods. Now, in the Bible, it talks about God's lowercase g, and in the Bible, in the Old Testament, it refers to God as Elohim, and actually, it also refers to other angelic beings as Elohim. But we're not talking about that. We're not talking about how there's different gods, lowercase g, that God created. Okay, we're talking about the ultimate God, the creator God, the one that has created all things. There can only be one of those. We also know that then God is all-powerful, but also God is a personal being. So that's what we learned from that. Then, from the teleological argument, so let's refresh on that. I don't know if you guys remember what teleology means. Do you guys remember teleology? I know it's a lot of information, isn't it? It's a lot of information. So teleology, to remind you guys, is design. So teleology is the study of design. And so we look at the universe, we see it has teleological evidence. It has evidence for design. And so what this tells us is that God is extremely intelligent. Think about the DNA, for example. All the code in one DNA is enough to fill thousands of encyclopedias of information, right? And it all means something. Like, what do you think the chance would be of like 1,000 sets of encyclopedias and every single letter just being arranged in all 1,000 sets of those encyclopedias in just the right way that everything in those encyclopedias actually communicates a message? What are the chances of that? Well, basically, there's no chance that that's going to happen, right? You can't just throw a bunch of letters. I can't even take a group of those like alphabetic magnetic letters and just throw them on the floor and expect it to spell something, right? Let alone like thousands of sets of encyclopedias worth of information and it actually like meaning something. Well, that's what's going on in DNA. The code is in the right sequence to build you to be who you are. And so, how can that be by accident? So God is intelligent, God is purposeful. And then last week we talked a lot about the moral argument, knowing that God exists because of morality. And just to recap, if you weren't here, talking about that if you try to argue for what's the standard of morality, what's the standard for what is right or wrong, how do you do that without God, right? Because if there's no God, if there's no moral lawgiver that transcends all morality, your idea of what's right and wrong is just your opinion, right? But because there's a God, we know that morality is objective. It's not based on my opinion. It's based on who God is. It's based on his character. And then he communicates that to us, but also we inherently know it in our hearts. We know what's right or wrong. And if we think we don't, or if we think that we know something different or better, That's only us suppressing the truth or trying to justify it. So what we know from the moral argument is that God is absolutely morally pure. He's without sin. He's holy. And so therefore God's moral nature leads us to the expectation of him revealing himself, right? Like, if God is perfect, if God is holy, he's a good God, why would he then keep himself a secret from us? He wouldn't do that. He makes himself known. So we can know him. All right? So this leads us to which worldviews could possibly, because we've narrowed down the field now. In Frank Turek and Norman Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, this is what they do. They narrow it down. They look at all the major worldviews and they say, okay, which ones can we eliminate right off the bat right now? And then which ones could possibly be true, because we're narrowing down the field here. Now, a lot of these on this list, that you see up here, are ones that we will visit. We will visit these. But right off the bat, I'm going to eliminate these. I'm going to say, look, these are not even possible to be true. And here's why. So first off, you have Hinduism. That can't be true based on what we already learned about God. What did we say about God? Is he part of the universe or separate from the universe? Yeah, what's that? Separate. He's not part of the universe. So Hinduism can't be true. Why? Because Hinduism believes in something called pantheism. They believe that the universe and God are equal to each other. That basically everything is God. That's what pantheism is. There are many worldviews that have that idea. They're also polytheistic in believing that there are also many gods, but really all those gods, you, me, this building, the pews you're sitting in, everything really is just actually part of God. But it's really just an illusion that we have our own individual identities and that different things exist. It's really just an illusion. We're all just God anyway. So based on what we said about God, that God is infinite, he's one, he's separate from the universe. Okay, Hinduism right off the bat, we can eliminate that and say, well, that's not true. That doesn't make any sense. Buddhism is another worldview we will look at, and like I said, we're not eliminating these to say we're not going to revisit these. We're going to go back and look at these worldviews. But we're going to look and see where there are inconsistencies. But Buddhism, again, they can be pantheistic or they can be atheistic. It depends on your stream of Buddhism that you're a part of, because there are different sects of Buddhism. Sects, S-E-C-T-S, okay? Sometimes I say that word like sect, plural, and then people think I'm saying something different. So a sect of Buddhism. So that can't be true. All right, New Age. New Age, if you're not familiar with that, you probably know it, and you don't know it, because you'll see a lot of the influence of that in our culture today. And so, I don't know if anybody's ever known anybody who sort of like has a blend of religious greatest hits or something. Like, they believe a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they like to consult palm readers and tarot cards and go to seances, or they pray to Jesus maybe even, but then they also say, well, I also believe that my relative is reincarnated, or I was brothers with this person in a past life. Okay, if you hear all kinds of a mixture of things like that, chances are they may be of the New Age. And New Age is very much influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism, the Eastern religions that comes from Asia. And it's really kind of permeated the American culture. And so one of the reasons why I'm so interested in apologetics in the first place is because, well, in my college days, I felt very unprepared to encounter all these worldviews, and I believed, I had faith, and I knew that the Christian worldview was true, and there was never a moment where I really doubted it, but it was frustrating to me because I just didn't really know how to respond or refute what some of these people were saying. And so I knew somebody in my younger years that was New Age. Very confused because on one hand, praying or talking about Christ, and then on the other hand, it's talking about praying to saints. And so I'm like, what, are you Catholic? Oh no, but also I'm reincarnated. Like what is going on? Like I didn't even know. Like, and then later on I found, okay, this is New Age. That's what this is. And so definitely came into contact with New Age in my younger years. Just didn't know what to do with it because I never heard of it. Didn't understand what that was all about, because it seemed very incoherent. But I understand it better now, because it really what it is a blend of different With New Age being pantheistic, you can't, that can't be true because we already established that God is separate from the universe. Secular humanism, that would be like people who are atheistic. They believe in evolution and things like that, that the universe came about by natural processes, that you and I are here by natural process of evolution. And so that can't be true because we already established that God has to exist, so that's not true. Mormonism can't be true because it's polytheistic. And I don't know if you guys do that. You might think, well, aren't they kind of like Christian a little bit? No, they're not. First off, they're a counterfeit Christian. They try to masquerade as Christian. They're not. And they're not even monotheistic like Christianity is. They're polytheistic. They believe in many gods. They actually believe that you too can eventually become a god. And that our God was once a man just like we were, and he became a god. Well, one day you can become a god of your own planet too. And that's what Mormonism teaches. So that can't be true. Wicca, okay, that's either pantheistic or polytheistic, kind of a mixture of both. That can't be true. Wicca is, I don't know if anyone's ever encountered somebody of that worldview. I've had a lot of contact with people in that worldview. There was one time I did a funeral for a woman who had a daughter who was of that faith, and had some conversations with her. Ultimately, she continued down that path, and she was questioning a little bit at that time whether Wicca was true. They would refer to themselves as a witch. Okay, now we're not talking about like old green-skinned ladies flying on a broom kind of witch. That's not what we're talking about. That's totally different, but it's not witchcraft. It's more of like a neo-pagan kind of belief system where they believe that nature has gods in it and things like that. So that can't be true. Number 7, Taoism. It's pronounced with a D sound, even though it has a T. That's like a Japanese worldview. They're pantheistic. Confucianism, which is a Chinese philosophy from a Chinese philosopher named Confucius. That's atheistic. And then Shinto, also a Japanese religion. They're polytheistic. They believe in many gods. So right off the bat, we can eliminate all these worldviews and say, based on what we've already established by God, like with the philosophical and scientific arguments, these can't be true then. We can eliminate these. Now, what could be possibly true at this point are these 3 worldviews. We've kind of narrowed down. Judaism could be true. Christianity is a contender, and so is Islam. Those 3 could be true based on the arguments that we've already made, because they all believe in one God who is the creator, who is separate, distinct from the universe. They all 3 of these faiths believe that. But now we're going to see, as we dive into these, they're very different. Okay? They're very different. Christianity obviously came out of started off as, many would describe it as a sect of Judaism, right? Because it came from, the early church came from within the nation of Israel, and then obviously it was extended out to the Gentiles. And then what ended up happening is that the nation of Israel, the majority of them rejected Jesus as the Messiah. And so more Gentile converts came into the faith, whereas most Jews were starting to reject the Messiah. And so that's the main difference between us and Judaism, really, is as they reject the Messiah. And so you would say, well, do we worship the same God as them, though, yet still? And I would argue no. I don't think we worship the same God. Judaism and Christianity, we do not. Why? Well, because Jesus talked a lot about how, you think you know the Father, but you have never heard his voice, nor seen his form, nor does his word dwell in you, for you do not believe in the one he has sent. That's in John chapter 5. So basically what Jesus is saying, also in John chapter 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So basically what Jesus is saying, and he was saying this, who's his audience he's saying this to? Well, he's saying to the Jews. He's saying, you don't really know God, you claim to, but you don't, because here I am. Jesus is God in the flesh, in their person, in their presence, and they're rejecting him, they're not recognizing him. So if they're rejecting God in their midst, then they really don't know him. If they would have known him, they would have recognized him. So no, we don't worship the same God. And I would argue the same thing then for Islam. We don't worship the same gods then. Because again, they reject who Jesus is. They accept Jesus into their religion. They believe he's a part of their religion. They believe he's a prophet. They actually also will use the title Messiah. They'll say, yep, Jesus is the Messiah. but that means something totally different to them. They reject his divinity. They reject that he died on the cross. If you read the Quran, it actually says that Jesus did not, it explicitly says Jesus did not die on the cross, that God or Allah only made it look like Jesus died on the cross, but he actually took him away into heaven. And so it was this whole confusion, and so Christians are believing the lie, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. So again, no. But based on the arguments we just made, these three could possibly be true, but we're going to obviously see the argument for why is Christianity the one true religion. And then, when we get into, probably next spring after Christmas, we're actually going to get into these worldviews and talk about them in more depth, and what do they believe, how do you have a conversation with somebody in that worldview, how do you refute their claims, how do you defend the Christian faith. All right, so with that little introduction, we're going to talk today about miracles, because one of the things that has to be possible for Christianity to be true is miracles. Well, think about that. What is the number one central event in the Bible that we could go to and say, if that's true, Christianity is true, if it's false, Christianity is false? What is that one thing?
Resurrection.
The resurrection, you got it, all right? So we're going to start to build the case for, did the resurrection happen? And the resurrection by nature would have been a miracle, right? Why? Because it goes against natural law. People just aren't every day just dying and then popping up again alive. Like, that just doesn't happen. So for somebody to die and actually come back to life, and that's a special event that has to have been what we would define as a miracle. So are miracles true? Do miracles happen? Are they possible? Because if miracles can't happen, if miracles aren't true, then the resurrection can't be true, and therefore Christianity can't be true. So let's talk about miracles, what they are, what they are not. Okay? Well, the first thing here we have is Genesis 1:1. And this is the very first verse of the Bible. And I think this is something you can just sit about if you have trouble having faith in miracles or having faith in the resurrection in general. Just think about this. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Is that a miracle? Absolutely, right? Things don't just pop into existence on their own. And we've already made the argument for the universe had a beginning, the universe has to have a cause, so therefore we know that happened. And so in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Norman Geisler and Frank Turek make the argument that, look, if God created the heavens and the earth, that's a miracle, right? And if that's true, then every other miracle in history is at least possible, right? Because you can almost argue that the resurrection is, even though it is the most important event, it is the most important miracle in the Bible, it probably is child's play for God compared to what he did here in Genesis 1:1. Just think about that. The power of his words. The power, the ability to just speak and then something exists. Just by your words. Like, there's a lot of power. And we have power in our words too. Like, the Bible talks about the tongue and how it can really have a lot of effect. But we don't have that much power in our words that we can make something exist out of nothing. That's amazing. We do have the ability to create. We are in the image of God, so we have some characteristics that are similar to God. We can create, we can make things, right? And maybe some of you in here have made things. All right? You've crafted things together with your own hand. But the difference is between what you made and what God made is you had to use existing materials to put that thing together. God had no materials to work with. He just made it exist. And so think about that. Meditate on that. Think about that. Like, okay, well, we already made the argument that the universe had to have a beginning, so it had to have a cause. Meditate on that. Think about it. If God can make the universe exist out of nothing, then everything else is at least possible. All right. So we want to make a distinction here between miracles and natural laws. All right. So the definition of a miracle is a special act of God that interrupts the normal course of events. These are acts only God can perform. All right. So somebody rising from the dead, that just doesn't happen naturally. Somebody who is paralyzed being healed, or somebody who's blind being healed, being able to see again. Somebody walking on water like Jesus did, or calming the storm. Those are things that just don't happen. For something like that to happen, you need something that it's something, a special act that comes in and either suspends natural law, suspends the laws of physics or whatever, or overcomes or overpowers those forces. For example, we have the law of gravity. Okay, so you know that if you're going to try to walk across a swimming pool on top of the water, what's going to happen as soon as you take that first step off the edge? What's going to happen? You're going down. Yeah. If you walk right straight off of a diving board, you might sink all the way to the bottom, right? That's what's going to happen. That's the natural course of things. But Jesus, in the case of Jesus, where he walked on the water, well then something had to be overridden or something had to be overpowered for Jesus to have the ability to walk on the water. So that's a miracle. Like people just don't, like in everyday occurrences, just don't do that. And so that's the definition of a miracle. A natural law then is what describes what happens regularly by natural causes. So gravity, natural way of things. There's just certain ways that the laws of physics and laws of nature work, and we know what they are. We discover them through science, and that's just the way things are going to be, unless something comes in that's supernatural that is going to break those laws, or suspend them, or temporarily suspend them. So that's the difference. So the next slide, I think I already said this, so it's kind of a repeat. If God exists, miracles are possible. Obviously, because of creation, something out of nothing is the greatest miracle of all. I would say greatest miracle of all, most impressive miracle of all, but not the most important, right? Because the resurrection is. And then number 3, if the universe was created out of nothing, then all other miracles are at least possible. All right, let's take a look at the slide with the boxes. There we go. So this is how we would view the world versus how somebody who doesn't believe in the supernatural. In a naturalistic worldview, they believe in something called, so this would be somebody who's like a humanist, secular humanist, an atheist. They believe that the only thing that exists is the natural world or material world. They believe it's called naturalism or materialism. And so what they believe is there is no supernatural, that nothing supernatural exists. And so they would look at the box like the one on the left, that it's a closed box. That's all that exists, and it's closed. There's nothing outside the box, and nothing is going to be able to reach into the box to suspend natural law. It's not going to happen. And so if gravity always works, if it always has worked, it's always going to work, and there's going to be no exceptions. Because there's nothing supernatural outside the box that's going to reach into the box and manipulate things. Whereas the theistic worldview, belief in God, views the box like this. It's a box, but it's open, and there's something outside the box. Well, that would be the Creator. That would be God. The box is open. He has the ability to reach into the box and suspend natural law or physics in any way he chooses, whenever and however he chooses to do so. And so that's why we say, well, miracles are possible. We've seen them. I'm going to skip to the slide that says, why doesn't God make himself more obvious? So that's a few slides ahead of that. And it looks like that. Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right, so can somebody look up, get one person to look up each one of these verses? Genesis 3, 8 to 10. Tracy, Sue, can you do Romans 1:20? And Glenn, can you do Luke 16:31? All right, I want to talk about these. So the question that we have is, if miracles are possible, God can do it, why don't we see more of that? why isn't God's existence more obvious? So obviously, like right now, I'm looking around like, I'm not actually seeing God. I'm not actually hearing his voice right now. Has anybody ever actually heard the audible voice of God in here? You have? Okay. That's rare. That's rare. That can happen, but I've never actually heard his audible voice. I mean, we can recognize his voice through his word and through when we're praying and stuff like that, but actually physically hearing God's voice with my ear, that's never happened to me. I've only known a few people in my lifetime that actually said that they have had that experience. And so you're one of the exceptions, one of the rare ones. Why doesn't he do that more often? Or why doesn't he not only maybe speak that you can hear him audibly, but why doesn't he like appear in a way that we can see him? Well, let's talk about these with these verses here. Genesis 3:8-10. Tracy.
The man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from him, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees in the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid."
All right. Did you guys notice that when Adam and Eve sinned, it was actually their choice? And when they sinned, because of their sin, they felt shame. And it was Adam and Eve, they were the ones that hid from God, not the other way around. They heard God's voice, they heard him walking in the garden in the cool of the day, they were the ones that hid. And really, because of our sin nature, because of who we are, we're the ones that are hiding from God. It's not the other way around. We're hiding from him. And yet we accuse him of being the one that's hiding from us. All right, Romans 1:20.
For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse.
All right. So in Romans 1, it's talking about how God has given men over to their depraved mind, their sinful nature, and he's saying, but you know what? Like since the beginning, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, the fact that God even exists, is very evident through all that has been made. You can't look at this universe and say, first of all, you can't say this got here by accident. It's got here by natural processes, and then you can also look at the grandeur of it and the design of it and just the beauty of it and say, no, I don't think that there's a divine being out there that created all this, or that there's a divine being out there that created all this and also interacts sometimes in this creation. It says man is without excuse. So you can't go to God and say at Judgment Day and say, God, you gotta let me off the hook because you didn't tell me you existed. You can't even say, somebody who lived in a place where maybe they never got the gospel message and say, well, God, you never told me, you never got the message to me. No, it's right here in Romans 1 saying you're without excuse. You can't say, God, I didn't know you existed. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, there's atheists out there that don't believe God exists. And actually, there really is no such thing as an atheist. I mean, an atheist is just somebody who they really actually, deep down, they know he exists. They just don't want him to. They suppress the truth. Again, we're the ones that hide on God, not the other way around. So we're without excuse. Luke 16:31.
He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced either someone rises.
Yeah, I like that verse. And let me give you some context because there's a much larger passage that verse comes out of. What's going on here is Jesus is telling a parable about the rich man and Lazarus. Does anybody know this parable? Remember this? Rich man and Lazarus. Rich man and Lazarus, there was a man named Lazarus, and he sat by this gate, and he begged. And there was a rich man that would go by. He wouldn't give him anything. He wouldn't help him out. It says the poor man that would sit there, even the dogs would come and lick his sores. And then a time came when they both died, and they both went to Hades. And so, not to get into that whole thing about what happened to people when they died before Christ, but what seems to be the case is that everybody went to what the Greeks called Hades, this realm of the dead, and that there seemed to be a place, a separation between the righteous and the unrighteous. And so it talks about the beggar, the poor man going to Abraham's side, so that means he went to where Abraham was, and it seemed to be this paradise where they had rest, and it was where the righteous would go. And then those that were unrighteous were across this great chasm, because the rich man calls out to Father Abraham and says, could you please just dip your finger in some water and put it on my tongue, because I'm in such agony. And Abraham says, I can't do it because there's this great chasm between us. Can't do it. There's this separation between the righteous and the unrighteous. And he says, well, the man said to Abraham, well, at least go back and tell my brothers about what has happened to me so that they won't meet the same fate. And Abraham said, no, we can't do that because they have the law and the prophets. So basically God's word, the law and the prophets. He said if they don't listen to the law and the prophets, they're not going to be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. So what this is saying here is that, for some of us we say, like, God, why doesn't he just show me a miracle? Why doesn't he just show up and prove it right here and now? God, come down and show me a sign right now. Show me, prove to me you exist. And what this is saying is like, you know what, for some people, even if God did do that, you're not going to believe anyway. This here also directly connects to what ends up happening with Jesus. Jesus did do a great miracle, the greatest of, the most important of all, by rising from the dead. And it was undeniable. And people knew it. The Jewish leaders knew it. They knew what happened, but they still didn't care. They saw the greatest sign, the sign of Jonah, we call it, right? And yet they still rejected it. So when someone says that, you can ask them the question. If somebody says, like, oh, well, why doesn't God show himself to me? Why doesn't he make himself more obvious? Why doesn't he do a miracle so that I'll be convinced? First off, you can ask the question, well, why do you need God to do that? Do you really need God to do a miracle for you to believe and have faith? And if he would do that, what would you believe anyway? Frank Turek always asks this question, the guy that wrote the book that we've been using. He always asks the question to somebody, if Christianity were true, and if we could prove it, would you become a Christian? And if somebody says no, well, then there you have your answer. That's a heart problem, that's a heart issue. They're not going to become a Christian, even if the evidence is undeniable. Some people are just not going to believe. But I think for some, might it take a miracle? Yeah, maybe that's why sometimes God does do miracles, because God knows that person would respond to a miracle. Some of us need to be bashed over the head a little bit harder. Some of us don't. Paul's an example. Paul was so zealous for God, but yet he was going and he was persecuting Christians. He was rounding them up, throwing them into prison. And then he was going along on the road to Damascus to get some Christians there. And as he's going along the road, he gets whacked right between the eyes, and actually literally goes blind. And he hears the voice of Jesus just saying, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Stop persecuting me, and I'm going to use you as an instrument to take this message to the Gentiles. And so that's what it took. That's what Paul needed for him to change his direction in life, in the course of his life, and to submit himself to Christ and actually believe and have faith. Some of us, we don't maybe need a miracle to have that, right? Some of us, for me, I don't remember a time not believing. I just grew up in a home where I was taught the gospel message. I was brought to Sunday school and church from an early age. And so, for a while, I did struggle, why doesn't God do miracles? But you know what, I'm just probably somebody who doesn't need that. Somebody else might need a miracle to really show. Somebody else could be maybe shown a miracle, and they're not even going to respond to that even if they did see a miracle. Or maybe they'll just explain it away in some other means. Say, oh, that was just a natural cause, or maybe that was something else, maybe a different worldview. Maybe it was aliens from space or something. Who knows? Right? People have all kinds of ways of explaining things away. So God does make himself obvious, and he knows what we need. in order to know the truth. And some people are just not going to respond to it. You know, the question that I hear all the time is, what will happen to Christians who never heard the gospel, that live in a far off remote place, never heard it, they die? What's going to happen to them? And a lot of people like to go in there and say, oh, well, they're not accountable, right? Because they didn't hear the message, so what are you going to do, right? What's God going to do? Well, remember it says that man is without excuse. And here's the other thing I say about that. Again, it's us hiding from God. And God knows that if somebody in one of those regions, the furthest reaches of the earth, and the most remote places, really wants to know who God is going to make a way to get that message to them. Whether it's through a vision, whether it's through a miracle, whether it's through actually just getting missionaries to them, bringing a Bible in, whatever it is, God will make sure they get the message. Is it possible that those who never heard and die in their unbelief, is it possible that had they received the message through a miracle, through the word, through whatever it means, is it possible that they wouldn't have believed even if they heard it? Right? What we have to remember is that God is just. So whatever God has in mind in this case, we know it's going to be the right decision because God is just. He's not going to be unjust. We don't have to worry about that and say, whoa, God treated those people unjustly. No, because God is just. And we can believe that He'll be just. Everyone will get what they deserve in the end. So that's what I would say about that. Now, the next part is we want to distinguish between what is a real and what is a counterfeit miracle. So we got about 13 minutes. Yeah, so we'll start talking about this. A real versus a counterfeit miracle. I think too many times today, Christians can fall into one of two camps. We can either be like, I don't think miracles happen today. You know, like that happened maybe in the New Testament, maybe in the Bible, and maybe we even think like miracles in the Bible happen all the time in the Bible, but they don't happen today. Then there's the other extreme, and I've known churches or people like this that, and then this happened, and then this miracle, and then that, and then this person did this, and this person got healed, and then that person, like constantly, all the time, like there's these miracles popping up all over the place. And we want to be careful because there is such a thing as counterfeit miracles, and there's such a thing as faking it or trying to push the issue. I would also like to point out that miracles in the Bible, like next time you read, as you read through the Bible, in the back of your mind, take note of how many times you actually see a miracle taking place. I think we generally tend to think that the Bible is pretty full of miracles, but actually for large portions of the narrative, there are not actually a lot of miracles. Like think about it, like so in the beginning, God created the world, the universe. There's a miracle, right? But then after that, you also have to keep in mind that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 covers thousands of years of. You can blow through those chapters, but read right through them, and you're like, wow, this is. You have to keep in mind that's actually an overview of a very large chunk of history, and there's really not a lot of miracles going on. You get to Exodus, and then, okay, now you see a big concentration of miracles again, right? Because God is doing something great. He's redeeming Israel out of Egypt. And so he sends the 10 plagues, he parts the Red Seas, he performs miracles out in the wilderness by providing the manna from heaven and quail and bringing water from rocks and all these types of things, but that's because God is doing something special in that time. But then keep reading through the Bible, and then when you see Israel come into the Promised Land, and you read through the time period of the Judges, and you read through the time period of the kings, like King David, Solomon, and all the rest of the kings, actually look at it, there's not a lot of miracles. Like read through those narratives, it's just stuff happening. It's not important stuff, but it's just like there's not like anything in there that's like, oh, that's a miracle, oh, that's a miracle. Right? There's nothing like supernatural taking place. There might be God's sovereignty behind the scenes, like even David and Goliath, like God's hand was in that, but I don't think there's anything like that's supernatural about that, right? It's not like there was laws of physics being broken by David using the sling and hitting him between the eyes, right? But it's God's hand. But as far as like actual outright signs and wonders and miracles, you don't see a lot of that. Except then maybe in the time of Elijah and Elisha, Then there's a concentration of miracles again, and then you don't see anything else pretty much in the rest of the Old Testament. Then you even have that 400-year time period between the end of the Old Testament and when we pick up in the New Testament. There's this 400-year gap where nothing new was written down. Not that nothing was written down, but as far as Scripture, it's inspired word that was written down, there was nothing. God was silent. He wasn't speaking through prophets even at that time. And then we pick up in the New Testament, and then there's a concentration of miracles again in Jesus, because God is doing something special again. And so miracles are actually pretty rare. If they weren't rare, then they wouldn't be a miracle. It would just be an everyday occurrence. But that's what makes them a miracle, because they're unique. So we have to talk about some things here that we want to make sure that we don't confuse miracles with. So first one is an anomaly. Okay, so sometimes in nature you see things happen that you just don't know how that works. For the longest time, scientists were confounded by, how do bumblebees actually fly? They didn't know. They said basically, and this is above my brain, my understanding, but the size and the weight and the shape of a bumblebee and the size of their wings, they said, really, for all intents and purposes, that bumblebee should not be able to be capable of flight. And they couldn't figure out, how's that bumblebee able to fly and stay in the air? And they just kept doing more research, and they found that, well, there's something about a power pack or something, some kind of mechanism in the body of the bumblebee that allows them to do that. Again, I don't understand it, but I was relaying what I read in the book from Frank Turek. Now, another thing is magic. And when I say magic here, I'm not talking about supernatural magic or dark arts. There is such a thing as that. There are, other spiritual beings out there that can do supernatural signs. But we're talking about sleight of hand. Okay? So things like, I'm removing my thumb. The kids always think that's pretty lame. Things like that, all right? I used to have like a magic kit at home when I was a kid. I liked doing like little tricks like that. I remember I had this like thing that was sticking on my thumb with a little suction cup, and then I would stick it to the back of the cup, and I would just kind of keep this hand out here and this hand kind of behind it, but it was actually attached, and I would go like, oh, I'm making the cup float, Or I had a deck of cards, and there was a hole in the bottom of the box. I pulled the deck of cards out, and then I had a wand up my sleeve, and that would go up through the hole in the bottom of the box. I'd reach down in the box, pull out this long wand, things like that. Like, we know nothing supernatural is happening there, but it's just the trickery of the hand, the sleight of hand, the tricking with your mind and your eyes and what you're seeing, what you're not seeing, that makes it look like something impossible is happening, and that's magic, and that can happen. Then there's something called psychosomatic. So this is something where maybe you have, because there actually are cases where you might feel like you have a disease or an illness or sickness, and it's all just in your head. Someone who's a hypochondriac, they might think they're sick all the time. So an example that's given in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is one of the co-authors, Norman Geisler. He, for most of his life, thought that he was allergic to flowers. And so one time he went to a church to be a guest speaker and speak. He was up front, there was a pulpit, and then in front of the pulpit there was all these flowers, these fresh flowers, And I guess it was springtime, or whenever flowers come out, I don't know. And he went to one of the elders and he said, you're going to have to remove those flowers. I can't preach with those flowers there. I'm going to have a severe allergic reaction. And the elder said to him, they're fake. And he was, oh, by the way, he was already having an allergic reaction. That's the other thing. He was actually getting irritated in his nose and eyes and throat by the flowers. And then when he found out they were fake, it went away, and he realized, what? It's in my head. And then he was never allergic to flowers again. And so it seems like a miracle, he's healed of his allergic reaction to flowers. No, actually it was all psychosomatic. And that could be an explanation for some miracles. Now, another thing is to be careful with this, satanic signs. And so there are things out there that can take place that, God's maybe not the only one that might do something supernatural, because there are other supernatural beings. They are not God, they are not all powerful like God, but they can sometimes do whatever God permits them to do. And they will do it as a deception. So demonic influence and so forth. We have to be very careful with this. And so when you do see something, if you ever do, if you ever have, what you have to do is what it says in 1 John is you have to test the spirits. You have to test the spirit. What is the message behind that sign? Because there's going to be a message that accompanies the sign. What is the message? If that message contradicts what God's word, what God has already said in his word, then automatically you know that that is a false sign. That is a satanic sign. And we need to rebuke that and walk away from that. Because that is not of God. And so that is something that can happen. Providence, then, is the next one. These are events that are caused indirectly by God using natural laws. Like I had said before, the David and Goliath, a very famous story, is probably more like a providence thing. The more recent example is Normandy in D-Day, when the Allied troops were crossing the English Channel to invade Normandy. There was this fog that came over the channel, and it concealed them, and that was actually helpful to them, that they could make this surprise attack. Could it be that God's hand was at play there, that was causing this fog through natural means to actually help the Allies, right? Because God's plan was working out through history. You don't think God doesn't work through history today? I mean, he definitely does. And sometimes we may not understand the direction that history goes. We say, well, why are you permitting that God? Why are you allowing that God? Ultimately, he's all directing it all to the ultimate culmination of Christ's return. So, God's hand. All right, but then finally, we do have an actual miracle. This is a divine, supernatural act of God. For example, raising the dead. That's the most important one. So, hopefully now we see the difference.